On October 7th, following the brutal surprise attacks on Israel, Hezbollah began its attacks on Israel's northern border. The attacks around Gaza and the attacks in the north caught Israel by complete surprise, and this led to a significant degree of insecurity within Israel. As Israel responded by invading Gaza, Hezbollah continued its attacks. Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah stated that Hezbollah will follow Israel's lead. Quote, "You expand, we expand. You escalate, we escalate." However, as the Israeli invasion of Gaza appears to be coming to a conclusion, a new Israeli war against Hezbollah in Lebanon appears all but unavoidable, and the consequences of this conflict will change the Middle East forever. Prior to October 7th, Hezbollah and Israel have maintained an uneasy calm. After fighting a brutal war in 2006, both sides have in recent years avoided a larger conflict, with only minor attacks happening between them. As a result of the 2006 war, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1701, which restricts Hezbollah to the north of the Litani River and Israel to the south of its border with Lebanon. Only UN and Lebanese government forces are legally allowed to be stationed in the zone between the river and the border. However, this has not been perfectly enforced. Hezbollah would use the fake NGO Green Without Borders to move troops and weapons closer to the border of Israel for small-scale strikes on Israeli troops. After the attacks on October 7th, though, Hezbollah would move more forces south of the Litani River and would begin strikes on Israeli troops on the border. These attacks would include multiple rocket and missile attacks on both military and civilian targets across northern Israel. Israel would be forced to evacuate civilians from northern Israel as it would no longer be safe, and civilians in southern Lebanon would also be evacuated. All told, over 150,000 civilians in this border area have been evacuated. Strikes have continued to gain intensity, especially as the war in Gaza appears to be drawing down. All of this puts Israel in yet another lose-lose situation. There are no good options and no easy way out of this. Israel has to fight in the north in some capacity to reestablish security for its citizens to return home and feel safe. And Israel has a few options to do just that. First, Israel can strike Hezbollah forces from a distance using airstrikes and artillery, however, not launch a land invasion of southern Lebanon. This would of course preserve the Israeli military, strike Hezbollah troops south of the Litani River, and avoid larger escalation. It would, however, be very imperfect. It may lead to higher civilian casualties due to poor intelligence of Hezbollah positions, which is something that Hezbollah themselves can increase the likelihood of by co-locating military equipment with civilian infrastructure similar to Hamas and Gaza. And this is actually something that would benefit Hezbollah just as it's benefited Hamas by basically becoming a propaganda opportunity, showing look at how Israel doesn't care about civilians when really Israel is striking at a military target that happens to be in a civilian area. Granted, that strike is using disproportionate force, but still, any opportunity is an opportunity. This option may also fail to push Hezbollah back north of the Litani River. Increasing general attrition is one thing, but unless you're going to move ground troops in, you're really going to have a hard time influencing the ground decisions by your enemy commander unless you're doing something more significant like that. At least not very quickly. A second option could be a ground invasion of southern Lebanon all the way to the Litani River, and this would be in an effort to reinforce UNSCR 1701. Now yes, this resolution also forbids Israeli troops from operating in this area. However, Hezbollah has violated this resolution multiple times prior to this conflict breaking out and since the conflict broke out. And neither the Lebanese government nor the United Nations has properly enforced this resolution since. And so that may in fact leave Israel with no other choice. This would be more effective in forcing a Hezbollah withdrawal north of the river. It may also lead to higher civilian casualties and destruction of civilian infrastructure depending on how Hezbollah chooses to fight. And it would not be easy to destroy Hezbollah or its forces in this area. Hezbollah has tunnels in this area, and it would still have all of central and northern Lebanon to generate combat power and to strike Israel. This action may also be very escalatory. Unlike in Gaza, this would be an invasion of a UN-recognized nation-state, likely without their consent. Other Middle East nations would view this action extremely unfavorably, to say nothing of other non-state groups in the area. Considering that Hezbollah is heavily backed by Iran and is one of, if not the strongest member of Iran's axis of resistance, Hezbollah may also end up being reinforced or supported by other Iran-backed groups from Syria. This action may also lead to direct strikes against US forces operating in different parts of the Middle East, including in Syria and Iraq. A third and more drastic option would be a full-scale invasion of Lebanon, and this is not something that I see as very likely. It would be better if the goal is to just outright destroy all of Hezbollah. However, Israel has to account for the ability of Hezbollah to move forces and equipment into Syria to preserve forces and weapons. Whatever Whatever is in Lebanon, though, would be easier to access by the IDF in this course of action. It would be a lengthier campaign, it would be incredibly deadly, and it would definitely lead to international outcry, especially across the Middle East. And this would definitely lead to increased support for Hezbollah by various groups across the Middle East. In either case, Israel does not have the option to do nothing here. With over 75,000 of its own citizens displaced by the fighting at the border and the nationwide trauma from the October 7th attacks, Israel has to reestablish security in the north and show that it can actually maintain it. Therefore, it has to push Hezbollah back from the border somehow. Obviously, this is not a good position for Israel to find itself in right now. It's geographically small and surrounded by countries and non-state actors that hate them and have fought wars with them on at least more than one occasion in the past 70 years. While it has a strong military, its performance in Gaza has shown that it's not as professional as expected pre-war, and the Israeli military is not particularly large. In order to generate size, it would have to call up reservists for the second time since the October 7th attacks if it's going to adequately deal with Hezbollah while maintaining security in Israel and resolving the fighting in Gaza. Hezbollah, however, is not your grandfather's Hezbollah, nor is it your father's Hezbollah. It is much larger, much better funded, much better equipped, much better trained, and they actually have combat experience now. They're better equipped to the tune of around 120,000 to 200,000 rockets and missiles, all trained on targets across Israel. These are not homemade or makeshift rockets like in Hamas either. These can be short-range and guided rockets to short and intermediate range ballistic missiles. Some of the short-range systems include old Soviet Katyusha rockets, and some of the longer-range systems could be even old Soviet Scud missiles. However, most of the systems that Hezbollah uses are Iranian-made, of all classes. Hezbollah's troops have also gained significant combat experience in recent years, especially fighting in Syria against ISIS and against anti-Assad forces. This fighting includes high-intensity combat in urban areas, something that they would see again in a war against Israel. Israel is now getting their own combat experience in Gaza, however they're fighting against Hamas, and Hezbollah would be a completely different experience as they're much better equipped, better trained, and could actually put up a better fight. Hezbollah has also had a lot of time since their last foray into Syria to refine its fighting doctrine and implement the lessons that it's learned in Syria into how it actually fights wars. Israel will not have that luxury. It will have to adapt on the fly and implement the lessons learned from Gaza into Lebanon basically immediately. Hezbollah also has well-equipped supply lines flowing through Syria from Iran. They also have a robust propaganda arm. They're able to disseminate massive amounts of information across social media and reach audiences worldwide. And the public support for Israel has worn off significantly since the October 7th attacks, especially across younger audiences. And Israel hasn't really helped themselves in this situation either. Poor conduct in the war as well as poor information strategy has allowed Hamas to gain the upper hand and keep it throughout the war. Hezbollah would seek to exploit this shortcoming on Israel's part and amplify it further. They would also have additional ammo, so to speak, as Israel may be invading the territory of a sovereign country, unlike in Gaza, where the legal identity is a little bit more complicated. Hezbollah could take this opportunity to rally around the flag, essentially, and to generate support for themselves, branding themselves as the liberators of Lebanon and as the fighters against imperialism, kind of as they have before, but this time, drawing support for themselves to generate funding, to build combat power with volunteers coming from abroad, to build political pressure on Israel, and while branding themselves as liberators for not only Lebanon and for Palestine. And at no point would the conversation really be about Hezbollah's own illegal activity or the fact that they are a terrorist organization. Israel themselves have done a pretty poor job combating Hamas's propaganda, especially on social media and especially with younger audiences. So there's no reason to think that they'd fare any better against the much better funded, much better equipped Hezbollah. However, with all of this being said, Israel still has to do something in this situation. So it's either accept the very nasty fight that is to come in Lebanon, or it is to accept the current status quo with tens of thousands of civilians not being in their homes and not being allowed to return to their homes, and with low-grade fighting basically happening along the border with Lebanon. And that nasty fight isn't just using the word nasty lightly. This fight would make the war in Gaza basically look like a little fist fight. This is going to be a proper war. And if they don't do anything, then they do run the risk of Hezbollah repeating the October 7th attacks, but in the north. It's not enough that this war between Israel and Hezbollah has to be devastating by itself. No, this has to be more complicated. Being that Hezbollah is the crown jewel of Iran's axis of resistance, Iran wouldn't be a quiet spectator in this conflict, nor would the rest of the axis. This axis includes the Houthis in Yemen, the Islamic resistance in Iraq, Syria, Syria, and Iran. Turkey, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt have all condemned Israel's invasion of Gaza. However, they're also rivals to Iran. They may not go so far as to support Israel against Hezbollah, but they would likely seek to find counters in Iran's growing influence and exploit any growing weaknesses. And this could be with targeting non-state actors in Iraq and Syria. This could be also with fomenting protests and upheaval in Iran or Syria. ISIS and other groups are likely to attempt to exploit the chaos, attacking everywhere, not only in the Middle East but abroad as well. Countering ISIS would likely become even more difficult due to the increased military action in the region, giving groups like ISIS more cover to plan and launch attacks. Now, all of this is bad, and yes, that last sentence is the understatement of the year. I'm not sure what the off-ramp is in this situation. Unless Hezbollah chooses themselves to move past the Litani River, the ball right now is in Israel's court. There's no chance they just get up and leave willingly. Israel likely wouldn't launch a full-scale invasion, instead opting to push to the Litani River in accordance with UNSCR 1701. This includes airstrikes and soft attacks further north to kill or capture key leaders and destroy weapons stockpiles. Main targets would be longer-range systems. Once Hezbollah's capacity to strike Israel has been reduced and Israel feels they can effectively secure northern Israel, they'll probably withdraw. And it will then be again on the United Nations and the Lebanese government to fill the gap between the Israeli border and the Litani River and to ensure Hezbollah doesn't push south again. Pushing to the Litani River, Israel will likely be exposing itself to further attacks by Hezbollah and other groups. Increased Israeli casualties and increased pressure as a result of Hezbollah propaganda is also likely. Israel may, however, just choose to accept the cost if it in fact can secure its northern border in the medium to longer term. This won't be easy and it'll all get much worse before it gets better, but this might take them in the right direction, or at least so they hope. The US will likely support Israel in the way that they have before, with bombs, ammo, and funding. However, I believe that this support will likely be contingent on the conduct of the IDF in this conflict. The leash is shorter now than it was before October 7th due to the IDF's conduct in Gaza. This led to the withholding of offensive aid to Israel. However, the initial invasion of Lebanon or an outbreak of war before the invasion begins might see a lifting of this hold. Now, that hold on offensive aid might come back if Israel shows a systemic disregard for civilians, the Geneva Convention, and the law of armed combat, but in the meantime, that aid will probably be lifted. In either case, if you're American, prepare for your social media to be even more of a hellscape than what it's been so far. Hezbollah will increase the tempo of its information operations across social media, especially targeting younger people. This will happen with bot accounts or through legitimate or semi-legitimate news agencies. Basically, this would be a repeat of the same tactics and strategies that we've seen out of Gaza, simply because they've been so effective and Israel has shown so few counters. Now, with all of this, I want to hear what you have to say about this. What do you think about this conflict? What do you think is coming next? What do you think Israel is going to do? And what do you think the Middle East is going to look like after this? Like this video so this video can reach more audiences and help grow the channel, and subscribe if you want more analysis, not only on this conflict. We talk a lot about the war in Ukraine. We talk a lot about other kinds of international issues going on. So definitely subscribe to join the Nerd Army. With all that, I'll see you all next time. Later.